What's up, RotoViz?
Welcome into the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. I'm Dave Caban here with a GLSP focused episode for you, trying to gear everybody up for week 3 of the fantasy football season. Thursday night football is wrapping up while I record this. So not a great one for my home team here, the New England Patriots, making their way into New York and getting spanked around pretty badly by the Jets tonight. But we will just move on from that and hope that fantasy teams that I am a manager of have better performances this weekend. So we're going to look at quarterbacks and tight ends in this episode. You will be listening to this on Friday. On Saturday, I will also be publishing an episode that will look at wide receivers and tight ends. When I have a better handle on exactly what the schedule for the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show will look like this year, I will let you know, but it might be at a different cadence every week yet. I just don't know. So, the other thing I will add too is send messages to rotovizffshow@gmail.com, rotovizradio@gmail.com, or at Dave Caban FF on X, and shoot me sit questions you might have or players that you want me to dig into on the GLSP or maybe wide receiver cornerback matchup focused episodes. Each week I should have at least one episode focused on that type of material, and we can dig into some of those players, help you make some decisions using the RotoViz tools. So we will now hit a drop. And we will now make our way over to the GLSP. So we're going to start here by looking at quarterback. Now, the top quarterback on the week is Baker Mayfield, and the Broncos are going to be facing off against Tampa Bay this week. In this matchup, Baker Mayfield has an average projection of 21.6 points. And the thing is, Mayfield has been pretty solid. I'm going to pull up the NFL Stat Explorer here. Mayfield has been pretty solid. I have a dynasty team that I ended up with Mayfield on last year. Just picked him up off the waiver wire. Everybody's been sending me trades left and right to try to give me strength at quarterback. And the thing is, Baker Mayfield has just been pretty solid across recent weeks. Now, I clicked on the wrong thing here, so we're just gonna go past that and not actually drill into Mayfield's stats over recent games. But the thing is, if we look at Mayfield in this matchup, his average stat line gives him 289 passing yards, 2.2 passing touchdowns. 20% of his comparable players found the end zone on the ground. When you put this all together here, you can see that we have 30% of his matches going for more than 25, and only 18% of his matches in the 10 to 15 bucket has more than a quarter of his matches between 20 to 25. So Mayfield, a pretty solid option at quarterback this week. Behind him, you have Josh Allen at number 2, which is pretty chalky there. But we also see Geno Smith make his way into pretty high point projection here, with Geno Smith at an average of 21, his 75th percentile at 24.9. Now, if we drill into Geno here in a little bit more detail, what we'll see is that his comparable players put up 26 completions on 39 attempts for 288 yards, 1.9 passing touchdowns. Actually, 30% of his matches scored rushing touchdowns. Now, his largest bucket puts him with 34% of his matches between 20 to 25 points, and a quarter between 15 to 20, another quarter going beyond 25 points. So pretty good outlook for Geno there. If you're looking for other options that you might not expect, well, you probably expected at this point. Derek Carr, another player that you may have gotten off of the waiver wire that looks primed to have a good performance against Philadelphia. Now, I was just working on part 2 of my wide receiver cornerback matchup article, and I'll just say it right now. This looks like a really good week for Chris Olave to have a big performance like one that you were hoping for when you drafted him this year that hasn't really manifested yet for him, despite some really great performances from Carr and the Saints offense. Rashid Shaheed should be another great option here as well. And from the Derek Carr perspective, what we'll see is that against Philadelphia, he should go for around 300 yards, 2.2 passing touchdowns, and 29% of his matches going between 20 to 25 points, 27% going beyond 25. So the GLSP really puts Geno and Derek Carr as two of the best options this week, regardless of whether or not you're looking for streaming options. Now, Derek Carr this season, back-to-back performances as a QB1 on the week, going for 23.3 in week 1, 24.2 in week 2. Now, I've talked about this before on the podcast that I don't like to look at back halves of season and extract those forward. But, I mean, I will just display this here, that since week 15, Derek Carr has been a quarterback 1 in every week except for 1. So if you're not sold on Derek Carr at this point, I think that we have ample evidence now that should make you kind of reevaluate what you're thinking about Carr as a fantasy quarterback. So continuing along here, Anthony Richardson, it does like Matthew Stafford against San Francisco. The tool does not know that you're going to be down Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. Obviously, not nearly as enticing of a matchup for Matthew Stafford there as this might have been had Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua been at full strength. I think those are really the names I want to call out. But we could take a moment here and just look at Sam Darnold against Houston. Now, the tricky thing with Darnold is you're still dealing with a small sample from him from his time in Minnesota. And it's going to be hard to trust a player like Darnold. His average projection in the GLSP this week is at 18.8. We do see more downside with him than some of the other players, with just 13.5 in the 25th percentile, which if I sort on 25th percentile, we'll see him kind of, well, actually, you know what? I take that back. That's actually a pretty decent 25th percentile projection this week. Anyway, 264 yards, 1.8 passing touchdowns is what you might expect from him in a matchup like this. Highest concentration of his matches, 25%, fell between 15 to 20. Now, Houston, as far as an opponent goes, if we go into the NFL Player Stat Explorer, we look at the matchup analysis tab, and then we call up Sam Darnold. And we use the formula and the strength of schedule streaming app tool, we will see that Houston's a pretty favorable opponent for quarterbacks as well. So we have two things that are telling us that Darnold might be a decent option this week. And if we look at quarterbacks in recent games against the Texans, it's been kind of a mixed bag with some interesting performances here. Joe Flacco with a good one, Anthony Richardson with a good one, not so much for Gardner Minshew or Caleb Williams. So 2 quarterback leagues, maybe you feel decent about Sam Darnold this week. despite what we're seeing in the GLSP projections, I'm not sure in a one quarterback league if I'm looking for some type of streaming option that I'm necessarily going to turn towards him just yet. I think, though, I want to transition now over to running back. I'm sure there's some players out there that everybody is wondering about. Breece Hall, it really liked this week, having seen a good portion of the New England and Jets game at this point. Yeah, it was probably right. All right, who do we want to open with here? Let's take a quick look at... I was going to say let's take a quick look at Rachaad White. Now, I'm not entirely certain of I saw an update earlier about Rachaad White and his health, but we will think about him and Bucky Irving here for a minute. So, as we talked about earlier, Tampa Bay is playing Denver. Now, Rachaad White, his average GLSP would put him around 13.7 PPR, which is pretty solid. Despite that, though, his highest concentration, 28% of his matches going between 5 and 10. Pretty limited upside for him in this contest. He would have 22% of his matches going between 10 to 15. Now, the stat line that is producing those numbers on average would be 12 rushing attempts for 51 yards, 20% of his matches scoring rushing touchdowns. But where a decent amount of his work is coming from, at least in his comps, is as wide receivers, with them averaging 4.5 targets, 3.5 receptions, 25 yards, but 30% of those matches finding the end zone. So there's a decent chance that Rachaad White would get into the end zone if he does play. Now, let's call up Bucky Irving here, because I know I have a couple of teams where it's possible I roll towards Bucky Irving. Now, at this point in his career, we're seeing a stat line that calls for just 6 attempts, maybe 1.5 targets, just 22 yards on the ground. So this really doesn't produce a very strong projection for him. If Rachaad White were to be out, I think that you're probably expecting Bucky Irving to be a RB2. Now, if he does play, I'm not sure that you're going to be trotting out Bucky Irving unless you're in absolute dire straits. But the thing I do want to mention here about the Buccaneers backfield is, going back to last season, this was one that produced a pretty good chunk of wide receiver 1 weeks, or not wide receiver, of RB1 weeks. Now, at the end of the season in 2023, Rachaad White was the RB10 in PPR per game. He played a good swath of games last year, finished as the RB4 in total PPR. So I just want to remind everybody that though you might have already forgotten what transpired in 2023, Rachaad White, this Tampa Bay backfield, put up a number of very solid performances. So suffice it to say, GLSP likes Rachaad White this week. I think that, if he has the green light and is good to go, you're looking at a player that you definitely want in your lineup, as the GLSP does like him. And if he's not there, I'd feel pretty decent about putting Bucky Irving into the lineup. Now, pivoting back to all players here at the running back position, let's drill in on Zamir White. I'm sure that he's a player that some of you out there are wondering what you do with heading into his matchup with the Carolina Panthers. Now, we've seen Alexander Mattison have a little bit of success finding the end zone. I believe that was in week 1. If we just take a look here at what we've seen from Zamir White here so far. Give me 2 seconds. So Zamir White in 2024 has put back-to-back performances of around 6.5 points. Now, Carolina, the strength of schedule streaming app, views as a slightly unfavorable opponent, and White has produced those 6.5 points on 13 rushing attempts in week 1, 9 in week 2, and an average of 3 targets. He's putting up on the season, just above 3 yards per carry. Now, we contrast that here with Alexander Madison, and his usage has had him with just 9 total attempts. So you still see White having more work. There were 6 targets for Madison week 1, 0 last week. Where I'm going with this is, though, at this point, we might have seen Madison have the better fantasy outcome. On the field, it's not looking like at this point there's reason to think that things have flipped off of what the prior or what your priors might be going into the season, expecting White to be the player there that gets the larger share of the backfield work. So White's average stat line would call for 13 attempts, 59 yards, 40% of his matches scoring rushing touchdowns, adding 2 receptions. So he gets 26 of his matches, 26% between the 5 to 10 bucket, 24% in the 10 to 15 bucket. As far as my thoughts on White go from an overall perspective this week, I view him kind of, I guess I would say in the back half of the RB2 range is what I would expect. Now, the reason that you might also feel good about Zamir White this week is I would expect that we see Carolina have some struggles. As a result of that, you have the Raiders coming out, getting ahead, and being able to run the ball. So perhaps there's some room for improvement there, and he could flirt with an RB1 finish. But again, I would expect more of a back half RB2 type of finish. Continuing along, let's take a look at Zach Moss. Earlier in the week, we talked about Zach Moss really asserting himself early on over Chase Brown in the Cincinnati backfield. Zach Moss will be playing on Monday night against the Commanders. His average stat line would put him with just 11 rushing attempts, 45 yards, only 10% of his matches finding the end zone. 2.6 receptions on average from his matches. Oh, you know what? You're going to have to take back everything I just said. Okay, here we go. No. I lied. I thought I had pulled up the wrong player. All right, Zach Moss. Yes, everything I had said prior was true. 40% of his matches going between 5 to 10, 27% between 10 to 15, just 20% of his matches going for more than 15. So the final piece that we'll add into this context here is let's pull up Zach Moss in the NFL Player Stat Explorer and quickly think about what we've seen from him thus far. So he had 9 rushing attempts in week 1, 12 last week, total of 5 targets. Now, that is more work than Chase Brown, but it's still not a very significant amount of work. At this point, he ranks just 26 among running backs in expected points and hasn't been efficient, number 84 in fantasy points over expectation per game. Sure, that could change, but I think what I want to say here is that, yes, it's true. It looks like he's winning out as the RB1 there in Cincinnati. Cincinnati's still off to a slow start. GLSP doesn't love him this week. I'm not sure that you need to try to force him into your flex spot. Now, I would think that a lot of the wide receiver heavy teams we have from listeners, there might be room for Moss in your lineup. But if you're in a league where you have a couple of options at running back, definitely don't need to try and jam him in. Trying to look for some other performances we might not expect. Let's drill in though on Javonte Williams. Actually, he became a popular player, I think, on a lot of 0 RB teams because there was a pretty decent outlook for Williams in Denver's backfield as the RB1. You could get him later on than other options that you might have put in the same tier. At this point, though, in the season, he's been okay, not killing your team, but not really making you think that he's going to be this back that really pushes your 0 running back team over the finish line we've seen him put up just 3.3 against Seattle in week 1, kind of recovered with a decent outing, 11.5 against Pitt in week 2. He was doing that on, a total of just 19 rushing attempts across those 2 games, 7 targets. The encouraging thing for him was that in his second game with Bo Nix, he was targeted 5 times and converted 5 of those receptions for 48 yards. So the thing we do have to keep in mind is that there's a slightly different context for Williams this year than the GLSP knows about. He's playing Tampa Bay. An average stat line for him is produced that gives him 10 rushing attempts, 38 yards rushing, 30% of his matches finding the end zone, adding to that with about 2.5 receptions for somewhere around 20 yards. This gives him an average of 10 PPR. Now, I think that there's reason to feel good about the fact that he's able to approximate this 10 and that we're going to continue to see him getting some usage as a wide receiver. It is a little concerning, though, if you're looking for your outlook for Williams, that 35% of his matches went between 5 and 10. Definitely the largest bucket for him. 27% between 10 to 15, and 20 scoring less than 5. So not an overly encouraging outlook for Williams there. This does put him, just based on an average projection, at RB 30 on the week. I will not be trying to force him into my lineups, or I will not be hoping that things kind of change and getting him into my lineups unless I absolutely have to. I think that there's other running backs that, if we keep looking through the GLSP behind him, that I might be a little bit more interested in. I'm sure a name that people might be wondering about is somebody. Well, I guess actually a couple of the guys I came to my head here, Antonio Gibson and Braylon Allen, will already have played. But let's look at somebody like Jaylen Warren. I'm going to bring up Jaylen Warren here, and let's compare and contrast him based upon the GLSP here for Javonte Williams. So you have Jaylen Warren at 9.6 PPR, and they're actually very similar if you follow them across the buckets. This is a very, very tight race between these two, and I guess you would break it in the case of Williams, given the fact that we've seen Najee Harris, have a larger impact on Jaylen Warren's outlook or usage than you're going to see for any of the running backs there in Denver. And, Warren, 9 rushing attempts last week, just 2 targets, only 2 rushing attempts in the first week of the season, 2 targets. Now, Pittsburgh may be a slightly better offense overall, but haven't really been crushing it this year. So that's not a major thing that you would use to break this tie if you're thinking about it. But we will also look at Najee Harris now. I mean, very different story this year. You've already seen 37 rushing attempts for Harris with the 4 targets, clearly getting the preferred work there in the Pittsburgh Steelers backfield. So let's take a look at one other player here in the GLSP that maybe I would anticipate a lot of our listeners are going to be interested in. Let's take a look now at DeAndre Swift. Of course, Swift, has a change in context this year that the tool is not going to know about. He, against the Colts, would have an average stat line of 12 rushing attempts, 46 yards, 30% of his matches finding the end zone, just 1.2 receptions. Really no upside for him, as 42% of his matches bucketed between 5 to 10, 29 under 5, giving him a total of just 18% going for beyond 15, which you're probably not expecting for Swift, but only 11% of his matches getting to 10 to 15. Just to get the proper context in here, too, we will pull him up in the NFL Player Stat Explorer. And let's take a quick look at his game logs. So week 1, 10 rushing attempts. Week 2, 14. Only 1 target in week 1. 15 targets, though, in week 2 against Houston. So that's actually, pretty good usage for him. In terms of expected points, that's RB 30 on the year. and he has not been efficient yet. But I think that, well, no, I'm not going to try to make a large case for Swift this week against the Colts. So hopefully, well, I feel like now I want to offer you, let me find, let's just pull up Zach Charbonnet, right? We still don't know if Ken Walker is going to play. Charbonnet, if Walker doesn't have the green light as a player, I'm definitely putting in over all of those guys that we just mentioned. Now, his average GLSP puts him with just 6 attempts. We know that would be different. So actually, let's think about Ken Walker, right, against the Dolphins. So he would have a much more favorable outlook, an average of around 12 PPR, and that's on a line at 12 attempts with 50% of his matches finding the end zone and 2.3 receptions. This gets 33% of his matches between 10 to 15, 16% between 15 to 20. So I feel pretty decent about Charbonnet against the Dolphins if Walker does not play this week. So he's probably the player that I have on the back end. I shouldn't say the back end, as a rotational player in a lot of my rosters. I would imagine our listeners have pretty similar rosters to many of the ones that I do. So, he's probably a player that you are going to be looking to turn to as opposed to some of these other players that you put on those 0 running back rosters. It's probably not some revolutionary advice there, but a cosign if you need it. So, glad to be with you for this episode. I will be back later this week with the wide receiver and tight end breakdown from the GLSP. I possibly, though, I'm probably going to be recording that pretty soon after this, so I won't be able to get to any of the questions this week. But please, RotoVizFFshow@gmail.com. Feel free to send your questions there, and I'll make sure to try to get to them on the show. So as always, thanks for stopping by, and I will catch you soon. Thank you for listening to the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. Send us questions at rvffshow@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at Dave Caban FF and at CPatrickNFL. Leave us a voicemail at 978-615-9214 and make sure to rate, review, and subscribe.